impressed me. Of course, the first thing that impressed me was the success of the Bohr orbit theory. I went to Cambridge as a research student, knowing nothing at all of the Bohr orbit theory, considering atoms to be something very mysterious and quite beyond the range of ordinary dynamical laws. And then it was a revelation to me to hear about the atom of Rutherford and Bohr. Rutherford had set up the basic model of the atom having a central positive nucleus with electrons moving around it. And then Bohr had found out laws governing the motions of the electrons. He set up his orbit theory, according to which an electron moving in an atom is subject to the ordinary classical laws corresponding to its charge and the field that it is moving through. The ordinary classical laws, except for that part of the force on the electron which is associated with the emission of radiation. That part of the force, which is just a small part, has to be cut out. Then the remaining force gives a stable orbit for the motion of the electron. That answered one of the most mysterious questions which people had been bothering about previously. How was it that an atom could have any stability? Why didn't the electrons all fall into the central nucleus, emitting their energy in the form of radiation? Bohr said that this radiation process just didn't take place. You have to neglect that part of the force in the motion of the electrons. And then you had a possibility of stable orbits. And further, the stable orbits have to be subjected to certain quantum conditions, certain new conditions quite foreign to anything which we have in classical mechanics. These new conditions involve a Planck's constant. If we have an orbit satisfying these conditions, then the electron in such an orbit can make a jump to another orbit, and when it makes this jump, it emits or absorbs a quantum of radiation, according to whether the jump is to a state of lower energy or higher energy. And the frequency of the radiation is connected with the energy difference by that famous equation, difference in energy equals h times nu. These ideas of Bohr were completely strange to anyone who had just been brought up on classical mechanics, but one had to accept them because they were so successful in describing the spectra of simple atoms. By simple atoms, I mean atoms in which there is just one electron playing a major role in fixing the states of energy, so that it applies to the hydrogen atom, which has only one electron altogether, and also to the alkali elements, where there is just a number of electrons in closed shells and one outer electron, which is moving about and doing the interesting things. This Bohr orbit theory was a complete revelation to me, and of course I proceeded to work on it, and I accepted Bohr orbits just as something which was fundamental in nature. That was rather a mistake on my part, because it gave me too narrow an outlook. I proceeded to study the Bohr orbits following the theory which had been given by Sommerfeld. Sommerfeld had obtained more general equations for quantizing the Bohr orbits than the ones originally given by Bohr. And Sommerfeld's conditions were expressed in terms of the Hamiltonian variables, coordinates and momenta. Now you first learn Newton's laws of motion in terms of positions and velocities of particles, and then you learn about a more general formulation of the equations, the Lagrangian formulation, where you have quite a general dynamical coordinates which are any functions of the positions of the particles, and then you have the velocities corresponding to those coordinates. Now, Hamilton, 100 years previously, had set up another form of dynamics in which the coordinates are replaced by momentum variables. Now, you might think that that's not an important change, but it led to greater symmetry and beauty in the equations. And Hamilton pursued this line of investigation just because he was striving for mathematical beauty. I believe it shows very strongly the genius of Hamilton, that he was able to follow through a line of work whose importance was not made evident until 100 years later. I don't think there's any other such example in the history of physics. Well, I studied the Hamiltonian theory of dynamics because it was found to be the most useful one for examining the Bohr orbits, as Sommerfeld had shown. I studied this theory on my own, reading the book Whittaker's Analytical Dynamics, which is a very good book on this subject, and I learnt about the transformations of the Hamiltonian variables and the invariance of those transformations, and a whole mathematical theory attached to it. I learned this up without, at the time, realizing whether it would be important or not, but simply that it was related to things that were important. The real difficulties of the Bohr orbit theory occurred when one tried to consider the interaction of two of these orbits. If you have the atom of helium, for instance. Now, the spectrum of helium was very peculiar. There seemed to be two different spectra associated to two different energy levels, and transitions between those two energy levels were extremely rare. That was a phenomenon which one just could not explain at all. One talked about two kinds of helium, parahelium and orthohelium, and one had no explanation for them. This was the situation in which I first studied in Cambridge for 2 years, puzzling over the difficulties and the limitations of the Bohr theory, and not making any success. The real breakthrough was done by Heisenberg in 1925. Heisenberg came to Cambridge in June of that year and gave a lecture there. The lecture was mainly on the anomalous Zeeman effect, but he did refer at the end of his lecture to the new ideas associated with his matrix mechanics, which were just beginning to form in his mind at the time. I'm afraid I was too tired to follow just what Heisenberg was saying at the time. It was very late in the evening and at the end of a complicated lecture, and sorry I didn't pay the importance to those ideas that I should have done. But that lecture of Heisenberg did not affecting me at all. It was just 2 months later that I received a copy of the proofs of Heisenberg's first paper on quantum mechanics. People didn't have preprints in those days, but they did circulate a few copies of the proofs to their friends. And Heisenberg has sent a copy of the proofs to R.H. Fowler, who was my supervisor at the time. Fowler passed it on to me and asked me what I thought of it. This was Heisenberg's first paper on quantum mechanics. I looked through it and I didn't think very much of it. I suppose I looked through it too hurriedly and I put it aside and went back to it again after about 2 weeks. And suddenly it got revealed to me, I don't quite know how, that this was really important work and that it was really something new which could provide a solution to the whole of the problems of quantum mechanics. The way Heisenberg had proceeded was like this. He said that we had been working all this time with Bohr orbits, but the Bohr orbits were really not very physical things. One could not observe the variables that come into the description of the Bohr orbits. One couldn't observe one couldn't observe the electrons in the stationary states at all. The things that one could observe are always associated with two states. The things that one could observe are associated with the emission or absorption of a quantum of radiation. And such radiative processes were always connected with two states instead of one state. And Heisenberg's genius enabled him to see that one ought to concentrate one's attention on things which are closely connected with what one can observe. The things which one can observe, being each related to two states, are expressed naturally as a matrix array of numbers. A set of numbers like this. And Heisenberg proposed that one should consider the whole set of numbers together. When Heisenberg first got this idea, he did not know anything about matrices at all. He never heard of them. But he was led to construct these arrays of quantities simply from the physical idea that one should work with quantities closely connected with observation. Then Heisenberg thought of taking the whole matrix of quantities together and handling these matrices as individual things. One would add matrices in a trivial way. One would multiply them according to the law of matrix multiplication, which was also suggested by the physics. One didn't need to have much mathematical knowledge to think of that law. So Heisenberg was led to think of these matrices as being able to replace the dynamical variables of mechanics. And he set up in that way his matrix mechanics. The main feature of this matrix mechanics is that if you have two matrices, U and V, and multiply them in that order, the result is not the same as V times U multiplied in that order. When Heisenberg first noticed this, I heard that he was extremely perturbed by it. You see, it was so foreign to any idea which physicists had had previously. Positions and velocities were certainly ordinary numbers and certainly satisfied ordinary algebra. How could one replace them by things which did not satisfy ordinary algebra?